Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our speaker series discussion with best-selling author Larry Tye and former Commerce Secretary and White House Chief of Staff Bill Daley. I'm Stephen Johnston, Managing Director and General Manager here at the Boston Harbor Hotel. As you all know, these events would normally take place here at the hotel, and we are open. We've been open since the end of June, so please do come and see us. The restaurant is open and doing a great job. We'd love to see our friends back here at the hotel. But despite the fact that we can't meet here together in person today, we're pleased to be a long-time host and partner with O'Neill and Associates for these timely and important discussions. So thanks so much for joining us today, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome the CEO of O'Neill and Associates, Tom O'Neill. Tom?
Stephen, thanks very much, my friend. It's great to be with you again, albeit it's virtual. We're welcoming back an old friend in Larry Tye, an old colleague of ours, back in the heyday of politics of Massachusetts as far as the O'Neill family was concerned. And Larry, it's great to have you back. It's been 4 years since your last book party with us, and that one was about Bobby Kennedy. And as great a success as that is and was, this book is every bit as good. It's a great book. And I have to tell you something. We're here with Secretary Bill Daley of Chicago. He'd been the Secretary of Commerce, and he had been the Chief of Staff to Barack Obama. He's a great friend. He's solid professionally, but I must tell you, as a friend, he's a great, great golfer. He sticks to his handicap. He sticks to his handicap and lives up to it like no man I've ever met, number one. Number two, at the last time we played golf, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we sat around a table and he said, "Hey guys, I've got a book suggestion for you, Demagogue." And I thought that, and I said, "Is that Larry Tye's book?" He said, "Yes, it is." He said, "You guys have to read it." I said, "Larry's an old friend." And I said, "Well, that's great. I'm going to evaporate and let you, Bill, be the moderator of this session." Let us welcome you, Bill, my friend. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it very much. And it's a real pleasure to be with everyone today. Stephen, thank you for also hosting this. And Larry, it's great talking to you again and seeing you. You had something you wanted to lead off with, maybe, Larry, about Tom?
So I wanted to just tell, if you will indulge me, a quick story about a young lieutenant governor back a long time ago. And he had had something shocking happen to him, which was the governor that he had initially run with and served with was knocked off in a primary. And he found himself as lieutenant governor with a governor who was not always going to be easy. And an even younger and totally ignorant staffer wrote a speech for him the first day almost that he took office with Governor Ed King. And this speech was an anti-nuclear power speech, breaking with the governor. And Tom's chief of staff and every political aide he had in the world said, "Throw that speech in the trash can." And Tom O'Neill read that speech at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. It did two things. One is it caused the governor to relieve him of all of his budgets and all of his staff almost instantaneously. It created a page 1 headline in the Globe saying, "Lieutenant Governor breaks with his governor." And it gave me a profile in courage that some 35, 40 years later still sets the model to me. So I'm really indebted to you, Tom, not for today's session as much as setting a standard of doing the right thing a very long time ago when that wasn't an easy thing to do.
Oh, you're a great friend for saying it and remembering it. I thank you very much. Of course, it ended my political career, which is now why I'm doing what I'm doing. But so be it. You kept me honest, my friend, and I love you for it. I'm going to go.
That's a great story, Larry, and not surprising that Tom would have that courage to do that. So Tom was right about the story that I had just finished the book when we were playing golf. And I found it a fascinating book about an incredible person that, to be frank with you, I didn't know a lot about. But let me ask you a question off the top. When you decided to take McCarthy as the focus of this book, did Donald Trump have anything to do with picking this demagogue out, considering the demagogue that we've got in the White House and the fact that for the last 5 years he's been so prominent in our game?
So if I knew how to be concise, I would answer that with one word, which was everything. But I want to say that I had signed up a week before the 2016 election to write a biography of somebody that I was entirely unqualified to write it on, a guy named Barack Obama. And the day after the election, I realized we will not know Barack Obama's legacy until the end of the era of Trump, but that a story on Joe McCarthy that might have looked like a story from ancient American history suddenly seemed like a story of today. And I believe to understand who Donald Trump is and how he was elected, we have to understand the story of the archetypal demagogue in American history, and that is Joseph R. McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin.
You know, when I read it, I thought to myself, if President Trump read anything and and had the opportunity, had that been written a while, you would swear he patterned his life after McCarthy, even though we know he didn't. Let me ask you, maybe you could give us a little flavor of the political climate in the late 40s as McCarthy really rose to prominence after his election in 46, sort of the 46 to 52 period, if you would.
Sure. So what I really would like to do is to take you to the moment where McCarthy's crusade was born and where the whole notion of McCarthyism was born. And that was on the date, we can point to one specific date, February 9, 1950. The setting is what McCarthy's staff called Wheeling, West by God, Virginia, which shows about how much they were interested in having their senator go to Wheeling, West Virginia. And that day, anybody who knows America's political calendar will remember is the birthday of Abraham Lincoln. And for every Republican in American politics, that day is a great day to rally the troops and, more important, rally the fundraisers. And in every Republican setting across America, they have a speaker come in. And if you're a big deal speaker, somebody of the caliber of a Bill Daley, you would get invited to places like New York or Boston, Chicago or Washington. When you were Joe McCarthy in 1950, a senator nobody had ever heard of and that everybody was convinced would be a one-term senator, you were invited to give the big speech in Wheeling, West by God, Virginia. And Joe McCarthy shows up there that night at a moment in American history when we had just watched Red China be born out of what had been nationalist China, when we had watched the atomic spies, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, be arrested, be tried, and be convicted and sentenced to death for espionage. We were about to teach our school children something that, Bill, I'm not sure you're old enough to remember. It was called duck and cover. We taught our kids that in the event of a Soviet nuclear attack, you didn't have to worry. All you had to do was put your hands over your head and duck under your desk, and you would be okay. And that was a sign of how petrified we were in America. And Joe McCarthy, like every demagogue, was brilliant at recognizing and playing to this fear. And what he did that day is he showed up in Wheeling, West Virginia with a large briefcase with two speeches in that briefcase. One of the speeches was a snoozer on national housing policy, which was something he actually knew a bit about. And had he delivered that speech that night, Bill, we would not be here 70 years later talking about Joe McCarthy, because he would have become that one-term senator. But instead, he reached deeper into his briefcase, he pulled out a sheaf of papers, and he held them up in the air. And he said, I have in my hand a list of 205 spies at our own State Department. They are people that President Truman should have known about. They are people who are making us as a country less safe. And they're people I'm going to expose. Now, what he had in his hand that night might have been a grocery list. It might have been some recycled newspaper. It was anything but a list of 205 spies. But it didn't matter. Within 2 days, Joe McCarthy was on page one of every newspaper in America. McCarthyism was born, and Joe McCarthy had taken off, and he never looked back.
But was that speech and the decision to give that version as opposed to the other version, was that his sort of gut sense of what was going to move things and how that would put him into the national limelight? Was it a group of advisors? Was it people on the outside who were big forces with him? How did it get to him? Or was this all his own good sense of politics?
So I would say two things. One is it was partly a crapshoot, and he came that night with two speeches and didn't decide till the last minute which one to do. And Joe McCarthy was a great gambler, and he loved to roll the dice. And I think he was trying every issue that he could think of. He tried for a while housing because he thought all the returning veterans from World War II needed housing. We had a housing crisis, and he thought maybe that's how I become a hero of all my World War II comrades. He thought about the issue of taking on the Nuremberg trial verdicts, and he actually he was the only guy in the US Senate and maybe on the face of the earth who defended the perpetrators of the bloodiest massacre of American troops during World War II, the so-called Malmedy massacre. And he said the verdicts were railroaded, and he defended these Nazi assassins. Only Joe McCarthy would try that. He was willing to try anything that would work. But I also think, having said that he was willing to roll the dice, I also think he had an instinct for what made Americans afraid, and that was communists. And he knew lots of people before him had taken on the anti-communist mantle. There was a guy named Dies, D-I-E-S, a congressman from Texas who headed up the House Un-American Activities Committee. There was a guy named Harry Truman in the White House who had a loyalty program. But Joe McCarthy was smarter than all of them, and that's why the movement is called McCarthyism, not Trumanism or Dyeism. He recognized not just that you wanted to go after the idea of traitors in a place like the State Department, but if you named the traitors and counted them, he knew in his fashion as the ultimate political cowboy that that would capture the imagination of the American people. And he got away for 4 long years with never disclosing a real spy. They used to say about Joe McCarthy that you could drop him into the middle of Red Square on May Day and he wouldn't recognize a communist, and that wasn't far off the mark.
You mentioned World War II, and there's controversy around his service or his taking credit for maybe having a more, not uncommon for some people, rather uncommon for that generation. Give a little background, if you would, about that controversy around his military record.
I will, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to share a quick picture here, which is this picture here. That was a famous picture of Joe McCarthy in his campaign poster when he was running for Senate, the first successful campaign for Senate. And that was him as what he called Tail Gunner Joe. He came back and had the perfect moniker, Tail Gunner Joe, saying, I'm a hero. I was out there in the South Pacific gunning down our Japanese enemy. And the truth was that his official assignment in the South Pacific and that island during World War II was as a very safe land-based intelligence officer. And so all the newspapers in Wisconsin and everywhere said, you're Joe McCarthy, the fraud. And Tail Gunner Joe became a caricature to the point where NBC did an hour-long documentary called Tail Gunner Joe that was basically making this guy out to be a liar. Well, now we can see one of the things that was opened up to me in the course of doing this research by the McCarthy family was all of his personal and professional files that he left to Marquette University in Milwaukee. They'd been under lock and key for 60 years, and for some reason the family decided to make them public. And one of the things that was in those files was Joe McCarthy's handwritten real-time World War II diaries. And they make clear that he volunteered, even though his official assignment was being on the ground, he volunteered to go up in planes under enemy fire. We also have in those files letters from his comrades in arms who were piloting those planes. And they said Joe McCarthy was the hero that he made himself out to be. He was on many of those missions a tail gunner. And I think this is a long-winded way of saying, Bill, the lesson is if you lie often enough on the few occasions where you're telling the truth, nobody will believe you.
It was fascinating to read the testaments by some of his military colleagues about the fact that he really did put himself at risk often, and compared to the spin on it. He was enabled, obviously, by lots of people. He was enabled by the big money, Texas oil money, that helped fuel a lot of his efforts and fueled his own lifestyle, as I understand it. His colleagues in the Senate, Republican colleagues in the Senate, who were scared to death of him and refused to challenge him, and President Eisenhower, obviously an incredibly popular person that stood for, at least ostensibly, was always viewed as the ramrod of decency, honesty, tell it like it is. And yet there's a lot of controversy about whether or not Ike could have stopped or should have stopped and didn't. And that whole relationship obviously plays a big part in the book, but plays a big part in McCarthy getting the credibility and the time to really not be seriously challenged. So maybe you could tell, I know it's a long and a complicated story, but Ike's relationship to McCarthy and how he helped create McCarthy in many ways.
So during his campaigning for the nomination, Eisenhower had a speech that he was ready to deliver on a whistle-stop train tour in Wisconsin. And that speech was attacking McCarthy for McCarthy's outrageous attacks on Ike's buddy, General George C. Marshall. And if Ike had venerated anybody during World War II, he came to understand that Marshall was a heroic figure. Marshall had also served under Truman as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, one of the great wartime and peacetime heroes. McCarthy attacked Marshall. Eisenhower was outraged, and he was about to deliver that speech. Only, like what we were saying a little while ago about Tommy O'Neill, all of Ike's political advisors were saying, don't do it. We might need the delegates from Wisconsin. Don't take on McCarthy. And Eisenhower, one of the few things I think in his political career he ever regretted is listening to those advisors and not giving that speech. From the day, so it turns out Eisenhower doesn't need Wisconsin or any other single state. He wins the nomination overwhelmingly. He wins election to the White House in a landslide. And from day one, Eisenhower's brother Milton, a wonderful academic and Ike's best friend, Eisenhower's brother Milton is whispering in Dwight's ear, saying, give up a little bit of your enormous popularity and take on that bully, Joe McCarthy. And Eisenhower said to him, no, you don't get it. We have to let McCarthy fall on his own sword. If I take him on, it will only make him more popular. I think that was a total cop-out. And in the year and a half that Eisenhower waited for McCarthy to do himself in, lives were ruined, careers were smashed, and damage was done to the country. Eisenhower should have listened to Milton. All the historians that excuse Eisenhower's behavior are giving him an unwarranted free ride. And if we think about Eisenhower as anything in that era, we should think about him as the enabler in chief of America's biggest bully.
And what about his Senate colleagues? Were they just taking their cue from Ike and avoiding it all?
So I want to backtrack a little bit and tell you, when I was a cub reporter, I worked for a newspaper called the Courier-Journal in Louisville, Kentucky, what was back in those days a great newspaper. And I covered a senator who I covered a guy who was, I'm sorry, at that time, a county commission chairman, a young guy who had just come in and won the chairmanship of the county commission that included Louisville, Kentucky. And this was a cutthroat politician by the name of Mitch McConnell. And I see shades of the Joe McCarthy and Robert Taft in the relationship between Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump today. Robert Taft was a very savvy senator from the state of Ohio. He was the majority leader, the Republican majority leader of the US Senate. Robert Taft would go around telling his friends, that guy Joe McCarthy is going to take us down. He's a dangerous guy. He makes charges that can't be substantiated. But he would tell that to his friends, and then he would go out to the public and say, listen to this Joe McCarthy guy. He's got something to say. We should all be, as a country, paying serious attention. What I think was going on then is the same thing that we see going on today. Robert Taft had an incredibly narrow majority for the Republicans in the Senate then, and he wasn't about to take on one of his own, Joe McCarthy, and worry about losing that seat to the Democrats and worry about stirring up controversy within his own Republican caucus. It is precisely the kind of enabling that a lot of Republican senators who know better today have been doing. And there's one more of them that I want to point to because I think she is instructive. One of the people who was very helpful to me in writing this book was a Republican senator from the state of Maine named Susan Collins. And Susan Collins' mentor as a senator was a previous female senator from the state of Maine named Margaret Chase Smith. The only thing that anybody in the world, if anybody knows who Margaret Chase Smith was, the only thing she is remembered for was courageously standing up and authoring what was called a declaration of conscience against her Republican colleague, Joe McCarthy. She did it with 6 fellow moderate Republicans. McCarthy savaged them the next day. He referred to her as Snow White and her 6 dwarfs. He was almost as good as our 45th president in coming up with slanderous nicknames for people. And I think that other Republicans watch what happened to Margaret Chase Smith. Susan Collins has been afraid of something similar happening to her. And I think that kind of enabling is something that will go down as part of the legacy of every senator who does it.
Well, it really is amazing, the similarities between the way people react to a demagogue and the fear of people who you, other than their instances with them, you really respect. I mean, here you just named 2 enormously respected political leaders, like, and a former military person, and she showed real courage, and it really is amazing the similarities between that time and this with such a demagogue. Throughout the book, there's a lot of Roy Cohn. And obviously, we all know that he's the idol of President Trump as his consigliere, or whatever you want to call him. Tell us about Cohn, and did he really have the influence? He was relatively very young man at the time, obviously, but did he really have that influence? Or was he riding the wave of McCarthy and sort of parodying McCarthy as opposed to being the puppeteer, or was he the puppet?
So that's a great question. And I think that the answer is that a lot of people blame all the things that McCarthy did on Roy Cohn. And that is crazy because Roy Cohn was, as you say, he was a brilliant and arrogant young lawyer from New York who, when McCarthy became part of the majority and took over the chairmanship of this very powerful permanent subcommittee on investigations, he realized he needed a chief of staff. And the guy he initially considered for that job was somebody as different from Roy Cohn as you could ever imagine. And had that guy, a guy named Bobby Kennedy, been his chief of staff, we can only wonder whether Joe McCarthy might have been different. But Joe McCarthy was the boss. Roy Cohn was the guy he wanted to hire. And while Roy Cohn did reinforce every bad instinct within Joe McCarthy, McCarthy was the one in charge. Cohn was taking his cues from McCarthy, and we have to blame things ultimately on Joe McCarthy. But having said that, I want to recount something that Bobby Kennedy said about Roy Cohn and Joe McCarthy. And I think this is a wonderful metaphor. He said, Roy Cohn took Joe McCarthy up the mountain in a toboggan, sent him down the mountain with no brakes, and they had a blast, a wild time coming down that mountain, but in the end, they were destined to crash. And I think that Bobby Kennedy partly got that right.
So tell me, through much of the book, the Kennedy relationship obviously started with Joe and Bobby on his staff, and there was a real closeness with Joe McCarthy and several of the Kennedy family.
So,
And the fact that Bobby was on his staff, was considered for chief of staff, and then sort of suddenly moved on. So tell us about that relationship and what really was behind it. And then was it truly over when Bobby left the staff of McCarthy?
so I want to just take you through a couple of the specific Kennedys, and they all had a different relationship. And we're talking about this, you're asking me that question in a perfect setting, because exactly halfway between where you are on Cape Cod and where I am on Cape Cod is where the Kennedys were in Hyannisport on Cape Cod. And that was where they had their best times with Joe McCarthy. And Papa Joe Kennedy, who was the one who pulled all the strings in the family, had a relationship with Joe McCarthy that I think was based in part on their sharing so many attributes and values. They were both feisty Irish guys who took their Irish roots and their Catholicism very seriously. They were both incredibly ambitious, and they both had a saying that I'm not sure whether I can say. I think probably we're not on the air anywhere, but we're being taped. And I'll give you the sanitized version of that saying. They said, for us, it is either the White House or the outhouse, only they didn't use the expression outhouse. And that was their notion, that they were going to try to rise as high as they could. And if they crashed, so be it. They knew that the chance was that they'd end up in jail or in an outhouse. When Joe Kennedy realized he couldn't make it to the White House, when as ambassador, he said some impolitic things about the president and about the Nazis and about other things, as we know, he wanted each of his sons in succession to be president. And I want to go to the son that matters most in terms of the McCarthy story before we get to Bobby, who is Jack Kennedy. When Jack Kennedy, as a young congressman, was doing something that took extraordinary chutzpah, which was in 1952, taking on a very entrenched Massachusetts white-haired incumbent named Henry Cabot Lodge. This was a year, 1952, when Dwight Eisenhower was running for president, when Joe Kennedy was smart enough to know there would be long Republican coattails. And he knew the one thing that would doom his son Jack's audacious bid for senator was if Joe McCarthy came in to Massachusetts and campaigned for Lodge. McCarthy had an enormous following in the state, especially among Catholics, and his coming and saying, vote not for my fellow Catholic Jack Kennedy, but vote for Henry Cabot Lodge, could sway just enough votes to cost Jack the seat. And Joe Kennedy turned out to be brilliantly prescient, because Eisenhower carried Massachusetts by a full 9 points, but Jack Kennedy beat Lodge by just 3 points. And Joe McCarthy could have made the difference. And in payback, Jack Kennedy, when it came in 1954 to the vote on whether to censure Joe McCarthy for all of his bad behavior, there was one Democratic senator who was most obvious in not showing up, and that was Jack Kennedy. And Jack Kennedy said it was because he was having back surgery. That was a cop-out. He could have paired his vote with a Republican who was going to go the other way, and he could have later on said, had I been there, this is how I would have voted. He never said either of those things. Eleanor Roosevelt never forgave him for his lack of a profile in courage in his relationship with Joe McCarthy, but that was his payback. Flash forward to Bobby Kennedy. When Bobby Kennedy was graduating from law school, it was 1953, and Joe McCarthy was just gearing up to be the chair of this powerful subcommittee. Bobby needed a job. He did what the Kennedys always did when they needed a job. They went to Papa Joe and said, I need a job. Joe Kennedy picks up the telephone and he calls his buddy Joe McCarthy. And Joe Kennedy had given enough money to Joe McCarthy that whatever Papa Joe Kennedy asked, Joe McCarthy would have said yes. What he asked was, give my son Bobby a job. Joe McCarthy said yes. Bobby Kennedy went to work for Joe McCarthy for 6 long months. He believed in Joe McCarthy. This was not the Bobby Kennedy, the iconic liberal that your dad was about to endorse in 1968. This was the early Bobby Kennedy, who was a McCarthyite, who was a Cold Warrior like his father, and who not only believed in him during the 6 months he worked for him. When Joe McCarthy was buried in 1957 in Appleton, Wisconsin, Jack Kennedy said to kid brother Bobby, "Stay away from that funeral." Bobby did what you will know, Bill, what kid brothers generally do when their older brother gives them advice. He listened to it and he did what he wanted to do. He went to the funeral because he remained loyal to Joe McCarthy till the end of his life. The only last thing I want to say about the Kennedys and McCarthy is that Joe McCarthy dated 2 of the Kennedy daughters, Eunice and Patricia, and he tried to date the third, the youngest daughter, Jean Kennedy. But as Jean Kennedy said to me when I asked her about that, she said he was an old man and I wasn't about to date that guy. And so she said no, the others said yes. And I think if he could have had it his way, it might have been Joe McCarthy that one of those Kennedy girls had married, but they would have had none of it.
So I know there's, everyone's got the ability to send in some questions and we'll get to them in a few minutes. So please, as Larry is speaking and as he's reminiscing about McCarthy's history and the political time then and the times now, if anyone has any questions, please just queue them up and I'll get to them in a few minutes. So he has this major battle with uncovering communists throughout, or allegedly trying to say he was uncovering communists. He then, his fatal flaw seemed to be, or fatal decision, was to then eventually take on the US Army. And became a big mistake. So why don't you go through, first of all, the run up to his decision to go at the Army, Roy Cohn's involvement with that, and why that was such a fatal decision on his part.
So it was a fatal decision for 2 reasons. Joe McCarthy took on the Army, and he took on specifically a base in New Jersey called Fort Monmouth, which was where the Army Signal Corps had the command and control operation for all the American military, for the Navy, the Army, the Air Force. And this was a place that Joe McCarthy said was riddled with communist moles. And it was an outrageously flamboyant charge, a charge that, of course, put Joe McCarthy back on the front page of every newspaper, and a charge that the Army initially caved into. A famous Secretary of the Army from Massachusetts, a guy named Robert Stevens, whose family owned a huge manufacturing operation. This guy said to Joe McCarthy, "Joe, you point out a communist and we will suspend them. We will do everything we can to take seriously all you're doing." And with Joe McCarthy, you never gave him an inch because he took a mile. And every time the Army suspended somebody, he would come up with new names. Every time the Army gave into him on the issue of whether there were communists at that base, Joe McCarthy would push on a personal bugaboo that he had, and that was getting special treatment for Roy Cohn's young friend named G. David Shine, a young staffer for Joe McCarthy, very wealthy family. McCarthy was paying him nothing. McCarthy didn't quite know why he had hired him other than that Roy Cohn said to do it. This guy, David Shine, was he was drafted into the Army. He was made a buck private, and McCarthy wanted to get special treatment for him, and the Army caved to that as well. And finally, at some point at the beginning of 1954, the Army decided, and Dwight Eisenhower decided, we're going to stop giving in to this senator because he's never going to be satisfied. They started pushing back. The US Senate looks at this and they see a fight going on between one of their own members and the American military. And they say, we're not quite sure what the heck is going on here, so we're going to convene a set of special hearings. The most famous hearings ever held by the Senate to that point, they became known as the Army McCarthy hearings. And I want to take you, at the beginning of those hearings, Joe McCarthy, according to the Gallup poll, had a full 50% of Americans saying he was doing a great job, which made him the second most popular public figure in America in 1954, trailing only our war hero President Dwight Eisenhower. I want to flash forward to a moment in the middle of those hearings when the most famous words ever uttered by a lawyer in American history, possibly, were said by a young lawyer from Boston, a guy named Joe Welch. In the middle of the hearings, when Joe McCarthy attacks Welch's young associate and says he is affiliated with a communist front group, Welch utters these words: "Senator, have you no sense of decency? At long last, have you no decency?" Now, any school kid in America in those days could have uttered those words because they became famous. And it looked like, and at the time we thought, that Welch had spontaneously said those words when McCarthy crossed the Rubicon of attacking Welch's young associates. The truth is, Welch had those words in his back pocket, ready to go with at any time McCarthy did something outrageous. And he knew enough about Joe McCarthy to know that that would be sometime early in the hearings. The other truth is, those words had impact, not because Joe Welch was a great actor, which he was. Those words had impact because America had watched night after night this guy that they started the hearings believing was their champion. They had seen that he looked more like the town bully. And by that moment, all of America wanted to know whether this guy had any sense of decency. And I want to just end by saying, if there's anything that those words are reminiscent of in American history, it is last week's presidential debate. When I think that if Chris Wallace had wanted to give the perfect response to the out-of-control commander-in-chief, he would have said, "Mr. President, have you no sense of decency at long last? Have you no sense of decency?" And by the end of those hearings in 1954, Joe McCarthy, who started with a 50% favorability rating, had seen his numbers plummet to 34%. Suddenly, the Senate developed a backbone and they took on Joe McCarthy, and by the end of 1954, they censured him. And the lesson was, there was in fact an enemy, the US Army, that was too big to bully.
We have a couple of questions coming in, so let me take the first one that came in. It was from an anonymous attendee. In your research, did you find anything that hinted that McCarthy wanted to be president? Or do you think he could have successfully run after Ike if he hadn't pushed the witch hunt so far?
So I should defer on that to the smart guy who really knows how the White House works and how politics work, and that is Bill Daley. But I'm going to take a shot at it, and then you can add whatever you want. So in these previously secret files that I mentioned that were at Marquette University, there were a number of documents that suggested that Joe McCarthy and the people around him were seriously thinking about his running for president. They had commissioned polls, and they looked at it. And I think that if he had been able to maintain that popularity that he started the year 1954 with, that he would have been tempted to challenge Eisenhower in the primaries in 1956. And if not then, he certainly would have been able to challenge Richard Nixon as the seemingly presumptive nominee for 1960. On the other hand, I think everything in his personality as a demagogue suggested that he would have gone too far and that he wouldn't have lasted long in a race like that. And I think he was one of the few people in American politics back then who could make Richard Nixon look like a reasonable anti-communist. And Richard Nixon famously said about Joe McCarthy, "I think that guy goes too far, and even I wouldn't go that far." And I think that the chance of his ever being president would have been, I think, nil, but the chance of his running would have been very strong. But what do you think, Bill Daley?
I agree with you 100%. I think that personality dictates people's success at times. And I think all of his issues, and I want to ask you in a few minutes about his health issues, especially during the Army hearings, that he almost had a death, it seemed that as though he may have had a death wish. And even though every senator dreams of being president, even those who have ridiculous dreams sometimes get real. We have a question really relates back to the conversation about RFK. This is from David Kennedy. Larry, in researching the book on Joe McCarthy, did you learn anything new about RFK you would have included in your biography had you known that?
So that's a great question. And I want to just say, if I could take a minute for a non sequitur, that the questioner is named David Kennedy. And I want to say that I went to high school a very long time ago with a guy named David Kennedy, who was Bobby Kennedy's tenderest and an extraordinary kid. And the David Kennedy ended up dying tragically of a drug overdose. And he was the son that I think the child that Bobby saw himself in most. And Bobby had rescued the night that Bobby Kennedy was killed in 1968. Earlier that day, he had been swimming at a movie mogul's home in California, and he rescued his son David, who was being swept out by a wave. And it's just I can't ever see the name David Kennedy without thinking about the tragedy of the Kennedys and that particular Kennedy who was the tenderest of the kids. But I think I saw lots of things about the Kennedys in my research on McCarthy that I wish I could have gone back and rewritten different things. And instead I found ways, as non sequiturs often, to stick them into the McCarthy book. But what I really would have liked to, one of the people who inspired me to write a book about Joe McCarthy was a woman named Ethel Kennedy, Bobby's widow. And when I interviewed her, she said something that I couldn't get out of my head. She said, Joe McCarthy might have been a monster to much of America, but to Bobby and me, he was just plain good fun. Now, there are a lot of adjectives I think of when I think of Joe McCarthy, but good fun aren't among them. And I thought there must be another side to Joe McCarthy that I'm not seeing. And that other side was the one that Bobby and Ethel saw. He was a guy that if I could have taken him out for a drink and done a long interview with him over beers, it would have been one of my favorite interviews ever, because he was an extraordinarily charming guy. He was a boxer in high school and in college, and Joe McCarthy saw politics as a lot like boxing, that he might pummel somebody in his hearing room during the day, but it was a game, and afterwards they should come out and shake hands, and afterwards he would invite those same witnesses to go out and have a hamburger and a beer with him, because he was a decent guy. He saw this as a game, and he had a huge blind spot in understanding the damage he was doing to people, and I would suggest to the country.
Another question. What was the role of the Catholic Church while McCarthy was making such a mess and being such a demagogue?
So the role of a lot of prominent Catholics, and the one who comes to mind most easily, who was Cardinal Spellman, who people back then used to say, the press used to dub him the American Pope. He was the most powerful Catholic cardinal in America, the Cardinal of New York. And his role and the role of a lot of his fellow official members of the church were one of enabling McCarthy. He had his strongest support in the Catholic community. A lot of the Catholic hierarchy was strongly anti-communist, and they saw Joe McCarthy as a standard bearer for their anti-communism. But having said that, I want to say that some of his strongest critics were people who were writing for publications like America magazine, the great Jesuit publication, and some of his strongest critics were Catholics as well. And I think the church doesn't deserve the blame for McCarthy. It doesn't deserve the credit for bringing him down. The Catholic Church, like much of America, ended up being divided about Joe McCarthy. So I could tell you stories either way.
Another question. The Senate's reputation recovered from McCarthy. Did that happen with the censure, or did it take a long time? And can today's Senate recover from its positions?
So I think that's a great question. It did not happen with the censure. The censure was developing the beginning of a backbone, but historians and the public, I think, continued to hold many senators responsible for what they had done in either standing up to or more often not standing up to Joe McCarthy. And I think it took the Senate a long time to reclaim its stature, to reclaim its profile and courage. And as I said, Jack Kennedy in 1960 was still having to defend what he had done a full 6 years before and not standing up to Joe McCarthy. And so I suggest to senators, I've been suggesting in op-eds, I've written 41 op-eds for newspapers around the country suggesting in every wavering Republican senator's backyard that they will be judged by what they do in standing up to or failing to stand up to a demagogue in difficult times. And whatever the momentary judgment is, history will judge them by whether they had that kind of courage.
You, as I read the book during the Army hearings, and obviously McCarthy had health issues, and alcohol being a major one in much of his period. The effect of his health during those hearings and the pressure and stress he was under as the hearings turned against him. Tell a little about that, would you?
So I will, but before I do that, I want to just say one more quick thing about Bill Daley. When I interviewed him, it was well back before the 2016 election, and there were two people that I interviewed on that trip to Chicago who I was hoping would run for senator from Illinois. One of them was a guy named Chris Kennedy, and the other was a guy named Bill Daley. And for a lot of reasons that I don't pretend to understand, Bill Daley decided not to get into it. I think one of the many reasons was he was a gentleman and he was ceding the field to friends like Chris Kennedy. And I think that I have regrets about the decision he made, even if he doesn't. And I hope someday he might revisit that kind of decision and run for a statewide office in Illinois. But you don't have to commit to that here. I want to answer your question. And the question is, so it was for years speculated that Joe McCarthy had a drinking problem. And everybody who knew him in Washington had some story. But nobody really knew what he did behind closed doors. One of the sets of records that was made available to me when I was writing this book was all of his records from Bethesda Naval Hospital, his medical records. And they take it from the realm of speculation to the realm of hard evidence. And the hard evidence is that Joe McCarthy had a drinking problem way back from the early days as a senator, and that from the day he was censured at the end of 1954 to the day he died in 1957, he was drinking himself to death. He was drinking what doctors said was the equivalent of a fifth of whiskey a day. And the official cause of death in the coroner's report and reported in every newspaper in America was hepatitis, that he died from acute hepatitis. That was a fig leaf. That was being diplomatic and trying not to do what was seen as a stigma of calling him an alcoholic. The actual cause of death, I sat down and read every one of those thousands of pages of records with the just retired dean of the Harvard Medical School and the recently retired editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. And they say the actual cause of death was Joe McCarthy drank himself to death. He had over the years repeatedly the DTs, and it was tragic and it was sad. And his addiction to alcohol, I think, goes a long way to explaining a lot of his most outrageous behavior.
Question from Jerry Berger. Can you talk about the McCarthy-Murrow angle? Does Murrow deserve the reputation he has as a result of the Hear It Now takedown?
So assuming that's the same Jerry Berger, a great journalist and a great public affairs guy for hospitals, he's asking a great question. Edward R. Murrow, every award that matters today in broadcast journalism, in radio and in TV journalism, is called the Murrow Award, because the most venerated broadcast journalist in American history was Edward R. Murrow. And one of the things in a famous movie called Good Night and Good Luck, where George Clooney played Murrow, maybe George Clooney played somebody else, but George Clooney was in that movie. In this famous movie, Murrow is credited with bringing down Joe McCarthy. The best evidence that Murrow didn't bring down Joe McCarthy is Edward R. Murrow, who said, "I got involved in the game way too late." He was like Dwight Eisenhower. When he got involved, he made a huge difference, but it wasn't until the end of 1953 that Murrow was airing his damning reports on Joe McCarthy. And the real hero was a guy that nobody listening today and very few people in America will remember. It was a guy named Andrew Drew Pearson, the most popular columnist in America, the most popular radio voice in America at that time. He took on Joe McCarthy early. He wrote 60 scathing columns. And one night at a famous Washington social club called the Soulgrave Club, Pearson runs into Joe McCarthy in the hat check room. And McCarthy starts slapping Pearson around. And if it hadn't been for a peacemaking Quaker named Richard Nixon, who stepped between the two of them, Joe McCarthy would have decked Drew Pearson. So instead, he waited a couple weeks and he decked him on the floor of the US Senate by scandalously accusing him of all kinds of things that Pearson hadn't done. And he got Pearson's biggest sponsor, a company called the Adam Hat Company, to withdraw their sponsorship of Pearson. He cost him a fortune. He's the hero, not Edward R. Murrow.
And another question from an anonymous attendee. What sort of role did J. Edgar Hoover have in both McCarthy's rise and then his downfall?
A great question, because J. Edgar Hoover survived more American presidents than any senior official in Washington. Hoover was the over-the-top FBI director. Hoover was the one who I saw in these secret files that I was looking at. I saw the words "top secret" stamped on one document after another. And these are documents that Hoover leaked to Joe McCarthy. Hoover helped enable McCarthy's rise to power. But when Hoover understood that Truman and especially Eisenhower were really out to get Joe McCarthy, Hoover understood that leaking documents to Joe McCarthy was no longer a good idea. The only thing more important to Hoover than preserving Joe McCarthy in power was preserving J. Edgar Hoover in power. So he started undermining the guy whose rise to power he had enabled.
Let me, we've got another question. We've got time for a few more if people want to type in some. Did Joe McCarthy do any good?
Great question. And the answer is, in the long look back at things, no. He raised the specter of anti-communism at a time when all the 24-karat spies had already been captured and outed a long time before. His movement, his anti-communist movement, his anti-gay movement, his anti-Semitic movement, all the things that McCarthy did set the template for all the demagogues who came afterwards, whether it was George Wallace or David Duke. He built on all the demagogues who came before, whether it was Huey Long or Father Charles Coughlin. And in the end, I have to say that while I would have loved to have gone out for a beer with Joe McCarthy while he was a legitimate war hero, the question of whether he did any good for America is an easy one. No.
And another question that's come in. How would McCarthy view Trump's relationship with Putin?
So I think that Joe McCarthy, to borrow a cliche, would be turning over in his grave. On the one hand, he would probably love the idea that his protege, Roy Cohn, had passed on his playbook to the guy that Roy Cohn was tutoring in the 1980s, Donald Trump. And McCarthy would have loved the idea that Trump was using all of his best techniques and tricks, but the idea that he was in bed with this autocratic Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, that would have been shocking to Joe McCarthy.
But if McCarthy had no principles, that this was, you know, it was a game, not a game, but it was his shtick that was working.
Yes.
And so, you know, why would he be so outraged? As you say, if Trump used all the tricks that he tried, some version of the tricks, and Roy Cohn was his mentor.
So I think that is a terrific question. And the idea, Joe McCarthy was the ultimate cynic and opportunist, and he would do anything. And so on the one hand, he would appreciate the fact that Donald Trump would do anything to hold on to power. On the other hand, in America, in that era, by 1957, when Joe McCarthy died, there were only two people, I believe, in America who were true, born, who bought into everything that McCarthyism stood for. At a moment when Joe McCarthy, who had started his crusade in Wheeling, West Virginia, bringing 2 speeches and not believing anything he was telling his audience that night, by the end, one of the only people who still believed in McCarthy and McCarthyism was Joe McCarthy and his wife, Jean. And by the end, he believed all the things that he knew weren't true about his anti-communist crusade. And by the end, I think he would say about Donald Trump, I love everything you're doing except this Russian thing. That's one thing that's going a step too far, even for me, Joe McCarthy.
One last question is from Tom Melville. Did McCarthy have a base, like the base President Trump has? Intensely loyal group of followers who remain loyal no matter what flaws are exposed. If so, how big was it? Trump's appears to be 38 to 40%, 48% of the voters.
So that's the shocking thing about McCarthy, is that he eventually reached 50% support, the kind of thing that Donald Trump has never seen. But their bases were very similar. They were populist in the worst sense of that word, bases that saw the enemy as anything on the East Coast or West Coast, anything in the establishment, and that could mean Wall Street, it could mean the press, it could mean the Jewish cabal that he would attack. Their base was inventing convenient scapegoats as enemies. In McCarthy's case, it ended up being communists. In Trump's, it's rapacious immigrants. And it was appealing to our worst fears and to our sense that somebody was out to get us, and he gave a name to that somebody. And it is incredibly similar.
Great. Larry, this has been fun. I appreciate the opportunity. I think I'm supposed to turn it back to Tom, who's going to close up the evening. Tom, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Okay.
Something like that.
That was a great give and take, Mr. Secretary. Thanks a million. A lively give and take and conversation with Larry Tye. Larry, how do people get your book, and how do they get an autographed copy?
So they get the book, ideally in any independent bookstore they can find, in the store or online, and they email me with their name and address. If they would like an autographed copy, I will send a signature plate, and my email is very simple. My name, LARRYTYE, as one word, @gmail.com. And I want to just say thank you to Stephen and to Secretary Daley and to my pal, Tom O'Neill.
Larry, you're a great star. I really do appreciate your time. Bill Daley, you were terrific, and we all appreciate your time and effort. To Stephen, my partner, thanks for opening up your hotel and having us all in.
Great.
I'll buy you a drink next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.